Hello there, and welcome to today's episode. Have you ever wondered why some people seem trapped in their worst memories, unable to move forward despite their best efforts? Or perhaps you've experienced moments where ordinary sounds or smells suddenly transport you back to a terrifying event, making your heart race as if you're reliving it all over again. These experiences aren't simply bad memories or overreactions. They might be manifestations of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, a condition that affects millions worldwide yet remains widely misunderstood. I'm Dr. Olivia Bennett, and today we're diving deep into the complex world of PTSD, beyond the stereotypes, beyond the simplified portrayals in media, to understand what this condition truly means for those experiencing it and how we can all become better allies in their healing journey. PTSD doesn't discriminate. It can affect anyone who has experienced or witnessed trauma, from veterans returning from combat zones to survivors of natural disasters, from those who've experienced abuse to first responders who routinely face life-threatening situations. And while each person's experience is unique, understanding the common threads can help us recognize, address, and ultimately support healing from this challenging condition. In the next hour, we'll explore what PTSD really is, how it manifests in the mind and body, the latest treatment approaches showing promise, and perhaps most importantly, how we can create a more compassionate and supportive environment for those navigating life with PTSD. So whether you're personally affected by PTSD, supporting someone who is, or simply wanting to better understand this important aspect of mental health, I invite you to join me on this journey of discovery and compassion. Let's begin by understanding exactly what PTSD is and how it develops. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a psychiatric condition that can develop after experiencing or witnessing a traumatic event. These events typically involve actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. What's crucial to understand is that trauma is subjective. What might be traumatic for one person may not be for another. It's not about the objective severity of an event, but rather how that event is experienced and processed by the individual. PTSD has actually been recognized throughout history, albeit under different names. During the Civil War, it was called soldier's heart. In World War I, it became known as shell shock, and by World War II, the term combat fatigue was commonly used. It wasn't until 1980, following the Vietnam War, that PTSD was officially recognized in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, marking a significant milestone in acknowledging that psychological trauma could have lasting effects requiring specialized treatment. What makes PTSD distinct from normal stress reactions is both its intensity and duration. While it's completely normal to experience distress after a traumatic event, these responses typically diminish over time as our minds and bodies process what happened. With PTSD, however, these reactions not only persist but may actually intensify over time, significantly impacting daily functioning and quality of life. The brain science behind PTSD is fascinating and helps explain why traditional approaches to getting over it often don't work. When we experience extreme stress or danger, our brain's alarm system, primarily the amygdala, becomes highly activated. This activation triggers our fight, flight, freeze response, flooding our bodies with stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol to help us survive the immediate threat. In PTSD, this alarm system becomes hypersensitive and can remain activated long after the danger has passed. Meanwhile, areas of the brain responsible for rational thinking and context, particularly the prefrontal cortex, can become less active during traumatic experiences. This is why traumatic memories often feel fragmented or lack the usual context of time and place that regular memories have. They can feel ever present, as if the trauma is happening now rather than in the past. Additionally, the hippocampus, which helps process and store memories, can actually shrink in response to chronic stress, further complicating how traumatic memories are stored and retrieved. This biological understanding is crucial because it helps us recognize that PTSD symptoms aren't signs of weakness or failure to move on. They're the result of actual changes in brain function and structure in response to overwhelming experiences. Treatment approaches are increasingly designed to address these specific neurobiological aspects of trauma. Now, let's explore the common symptoms of PTSD, which typically fall into four main categories. First, there are intrusion symptoms, unwanted memories, nightmares, or flashbacks where the person feels or acts as if the traumatic event is recurring. These intrusions can be triggered by reminders of the trauma or seemingly appear out of nowhere. Second, avoidance symptoms involve persistent efforts to avoid trauma-related thoughts, feelings, or external reminders. Someone might go to great lengths to avoid certain places, people, conversations, or activities that trigger distressing memories or emotions. The third category involves negative alterations in cognition and mood. This might manifest as persistent negative emotions such as fear, horror, anger, guilt, or shame, diminished interest in previously enjoyed activities, feeling detached from others, or an inability to experience positive emotions like happiness or love. Many people with PTSD develop negative beliefs about themselves or the world, such as "I am bad" or "the world is completely dangerous." Finally, there are alterations in arousal and reactivity. These include being easily startled, feeling constantly on edge or hypervigilant, having difficulty concentrating or sleeping, engaging in self-destructive behavior, or experiencing angry outbursts. The nervous system essentially remains in a state of high alert, prepared for danger even in safe situations. It's important to note that PTSD symptoms can fluctuate in intensity over time. For some people, symptoms may be triggered or worsened during anniversary dates of the trauma or during particularly stressful life periods. Understanding this fluctuation can help both those experiencing PTSD and their support networks practice patience and self-compassion during more difficult periods. Let's take a moment to discuss how PTSD can manifest differently across various populations. While the core symptoms remain similar, how they express themselves can vary considerably. For instance, children with PTSD may show their distress through play that reenacts the trauma, frightening dreams without recognizable content, or physical symptoms like stomach aches or headaches. They might also become more clingy, regress in developmental milestones, or show increased aggression. In older adults, PTSD symptoms might be complicated by other life transitions such as retirement, health issues, or loss of loved ones. They may be more likely to express PTSD through somatic complaints rather than psychological distress. Cultural factors also influence how PTSD is experienced and expressed. In some cultures, psychological distress is more commonly expressed through physical symptoms rather than emotional ones. Cultural beliefs about trauma, resilience, and healing can profoundly impact how someone makes sense of their experiences and whether they seek help. For example, in communities where stoicism is highly valued, emotional symptoms may be downplayed, while in others, spiritual interpretations of trauma might be more prominent. Additionally, it's worth noting that PTSD doesn't always develop immediately after trauma. For some people, symptoms may emerge months or even years later, often triggered by new life stresses or encounters with trauma reminders. This delayed onset can sometimes make it more difficult to connect current symptoms with past traumatic experiences, potentially delaying diagnosis and treatment. Now, many people wonder why some individuals develop PTSD after trauma while others don't. This is a complex question involving multiple factors. Risk factors for developing PTSD include the nature and severity of the trauma itself, especially if it was prolonged, repeated, or perpetrated by humans, such as abuse or combat. Prior trauma exposure, particularly in childhood, significantly increases risk, as does having pre-existing mental health conditions or a family history of anxiety or depression. Protective factors, those things that reduce the likelihood of developing PTSD, include having strong social support systems, accessing timely trauma-focused treatment after the event, and having developed effective coping skills prior to the trauma. Some research also suggests that certain personality traits like resilience, optimism, and cognitive flexibility may provide some protection against developing PTSD after trauma exposure. Understanding these risk and protective factors is important not just for predicting who might need extra support after trauma, but also for developing prevention strategies and early interventions that might reduce the impact of traumatic experiences. Let's take a deeper look at how trauma affects the brain and body, as this understanding has revolutionized trauma treatment in recent years. When someone experiences trauma, their brain essentially prioritizes survival over normal functioning. The amygdala, our brain's alarm system, becomes hyperactive, while the prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thinking and decision-making, becomes less active. This shift helps explain why logical reasoning often fails to alleviate PTSD symptoms. The problem isn't primarily in the thinking brain, but in more primitive brain regions focused on threat detection and survival. Even more interesting is how trauma affects memory processing. Normally, our experiences are processed as integrated memories with context. We remember what happened, where it happened, when it happened, and can place it in our life narrative. But traumatic memories often get stored differently. The hippocampus, which helps provide contextual information to memories, can be impaired by stress hormones during trauma. As a result, traumatic memories may lack this contextual framework and instead get stored as fragmented sensory impressions, sounds, smells, bodily sensations, emotions that can be triggered independently of conscious recollection of the event. This explains why someone with PTSD might react strongly to a certain smell or sound without immediately recognizing why, or why traumatic memories often feel like they're happening in the present rather than being recognized as past events. Understanding this neurobiological aspect helps explain why simply trying to forget or thinking positively isn't effective for trauma recovery. The issues lie in brain regions that aren't directly under conscious control. The body's response to trauma extends beyond the brain. PTSD is associated with chronic activation of the body's stress response systems, leading to elevated levels of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. Over time, this can contribute to a range of physical health problems, including cardiovascular issues, immune system dysfunction, chronic pain, and sleep disorders. This mind-body connection highlights why comprehensive PTSD treatment often needs to address both psychological and physical symptoms. Now, let's discuss how PTSD is diagnosed. According to the current DSM-5 criteria, PTSD diagnosis requires exposure to a traumatic event, either directly experiencing it, witnessing it, learning about it happening to a close loved one, or being repeatedly exposed to details of trauma, as first responders often err, followed by symptoms from each of the 4 categories we discussed earlier: intrusion, avoidance, negative alterations in cognition and mood, and alterations in arousal and reactivity. These symptoms must persist for more than 1 month, cause significant distress or functional impairment, and not be attributable to medication, substance use, or other medical conditions. Diagnosis typically involves a comprehensive assessment by a mental health professional who may use structured interviews and standardized assessment tools. It's worth noting that the diagnostic criteria for PTSD have evolved over time as our understanding of trauma has deepened. For instance, the DSM-5 added a dissociative subtype of PTSD, recognizing that some individuals experience significant dissociative symptoms like depersonalization, feeling detached from oneself, or derealization, feeling that the world is unreal, alongside more typical PTSD symptoms. There's also increasing recognition of complex PTSD or CPTSD, which specifically addresses the effects of prolonged, repeated trauma, particularly when it occurs during developmentally vulnerable periods like childhood. While not officially recognized in the DSM-5, CPTSD is included in the International Classification of Diseases, ICD-11, and is characterized by the core symptoms of PTSD plus additional features like difficulties with emotion regulation, negative self-concept, and disturbed relationships. This evolution in diagnostic understanding reflects the complexity of trauma responses and the need for nuanced approaches to treatment. A proper diagnosis is crucial because it guides treatment planning and helps individuals understand that their symptoms are recognized responses to abnormal situations, not signs of personal weakness or failure. Let's explore the connection between PTSD and other mental health conditions, as comorbidity, the presence of multiple conditions simultaneously, is quite common. About 80% of individuals with PTSD also meet criteria for at least one other mental health disorder. Depression is particularly common, with many experiencing persistent low mood, hopelessness, and diminished interest in activities alongside their PTSD symptoms. The relationship between these conditions is complex. Trauma can trigger both PTSD and depression, while the ongoing stress of living with PTSD symptoms can contribute to developing depression. Anxiety disorders frequently occur with PTSD as well. This makes sense when we consider that both involve hyperarousal of the body's threat detection systems. Specific phobias related to trauma reminders are common, as are panic attacks triggered by trauma-related thoughts or situations. Substance use disorders show strong correlation with PTSD, with many individuals turning to alcohol or drugs in an attempt to manage overwhelming emotions or symptoms like insomnia or nightmares. While this may provide temporary relief, substance use ultimately tends to worsen PTSD symptoms and complicate recovery. There's also significant overlap between PTSD and borderline personality disorder, particularly for those whose trauma occurred in early relationships. The emotional dysregulation, relationship difficulties, and self-destructive behaviors seen in both conditions may have common roots in attachment disruption and trauma. Understanding these connections is crucial for effective treatment planning. Integrated approaches that address both PTSD and co-occurring conditions simultaneously tend to be more effective than treating each condition in isolation. For example, trauma-focused therapies that also incorporate strategies for managing depression or substance use can address the complex interplay between these conditions. Now, let's discuss the impact of PTSD on daily life and relationships. The effects of PTSD extend far beyond the clinical symptoms we've discussed. Living with PTSD can disrupt nearly every aspect of a person's life, from basic self-care to career functioning to intimate relationships. Sleep disturbances are almost universal among those with PTSD. Nightmares may make sleep frightening, while hyperarousal can make it difficult to relax enough to fall asleep. Chronic sleep deprivation then contributes to other problems like difficulty concentrating, irritability, and impaired immune function. Many people with PTSD struggle with maintaining regular routines around eating, exercise, and other self-care activities. The emotional energy required to manage PTSD symptoms can deplete the resources needed for these basic functions. Additionally, dissociation or emotional numbing might disconnect someone from normal hunger or fatigue cues. In the workplace, PTSD can affect performance through concentration difficulties, memory problems, increased sick days, or conflicts with coworkers due to irritability or misinterpreted social cues. Some work environments may contain trauma triggers that make maintaining employment in certain fields difficult. Perhaps most profoundly, PTSD affects relationships. Emotional numbing can make it difficult to feel or express love and affection. Hypervigilance may manifest as jealousy or controlling behaviors. Trust issues stemming from trauma can create barriers to intimacy. For partners, family members, and friends, the unpredictability of triggers and symptoms can be confusing and draining, especially without proper education about trauma responses. Children of parents with PTSD may be particularly affected. They might experience secondary traumatization or develop caregiving behaviors beyond their developmental capacity. Research has even shown that parental PTSD can affect children's stress response systems and psychological development, highlighting the potential intergenerational impact of untreated trauma. Despite these challenges, it's important to emphasize that with proper treatment and support, people with PTSD can absolutely lead fulfilling lives with healthy relationships. Recovery doesn't necessarily mean elimination of all symptoms, but rather developing the skills to manage them effectively while reclaiming joy, connection, and purpose. Let's shift our focus now to treatment approaches for PTSD. The good news is that effective treatments exist, and research continues to refine and expand the options available. Evidence-based treatments for PTSD generally fall into two main categories: psychotherapies and medications. Among psychotherapies, those specifically developed to address trauma processing have the strongest evidence base. Cognitive processing therapy, CPT, helps individuals identify and challenge unhelpful thoughts and beliefs that developed after trauma. For example, someone might have developed the belief that the world is completely dangerous or the trauma was my fault. CPT provides structured ways to examine and modify these beliefs while processing the emotional impact of the traumatic event. Prolonged exposure therapy, PE, helps individuals gradually approach trauma-related memories, feelings, and situations that they've been avoiding. Through repeated, controlled exposure to these feared stimuli, both in imagination and in real life, the brain can learn that these reminders are not inherently dangerous and don't need to trigger the same level of alarm response. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing's EMDR involves focusing on traumatic memories while simultaneously experiencing bilateral stimulation, typically through guided eye movements. although the exact mechanism is still being researched. This approach appears to help the brain process traumatic memories more like normal memories, reducing their emotional charge and fragmentary nature. Newer approaches include trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy (TFCBT), which was initially developed for children but has been adapted for adults, and narrative exposure therapy, which may be particularly helpful for individuals who have experienced multiple or complex traumas. On the medication front, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, are typically the first-line pharmacological treatment for PTSD. Specifically, sertraline Zoloft and paroxetine Paxil are FDA-approved for PTSD treatment. These medications can help reduce symptoms across all PTSD clusters, including intrusive thoughts, avoidance behaviors, negative mood, and hyperarousal. Other medications may be prescribed to target specific symptoms. For example, prazosin has shown effectiveness for trauma-related nightmares, while mood stabilizers or atypical antipsychotics might be used for severe agitation or emotional dysregulation, particularly when other treatments haven't been sufficient. It's worth noting that combined approaches, integrating appropriate medication with trauma-focused psychotherapy, often yield better results than either approach alone for many individuals. The medication can help manage symptoms enough to engage effectively in therapy, while the therapy addresses the underlying trauma processing that medications alone cannot target. Let's delve deeper into what trauma therapy actually involves, as many people are understandably apprehensive about opening up old wounds. A common misconception is that trauma therapy primarily involves reliving traumatic experiences in detail. While some approaches do include careful, structured exposure to traumatic memories, effective trauma therapy is much more than just talking about what happened. Modern trauma therapies incorporate a phase-based approach that begins with establishing safety and stability before processing traumatic material. This includes building coping skills to manage distressing emotions, learning grounding techniques to address dissociation, and strengthening resources in the client's life. Only when these foundations are solidly in place does treatment move toward processing traumatic memories. During the processing phase, therapists use various techniques to help clients integrate fragmented, traumatic memories into a coherent narrative with appropriate time and context markers, essentially helping the brain recognize that this happened then, not now. This process often involves identifying and reshaping unhelpful beliefs that developed after the trauma. Finally, the integration phase focuses on consolidating gains and applying new skills to current life challenges. This might include rebuilding relationships, engaging with meaningful activities, or developing a post-trauma identity that acknowledges but isn't defined by traumatic experiences. Throughout this process, the therapeutic relationship itself is a crucial healing factor. Having a trustworthy, consistent relationship in which to process trauma can begin to counter trauma-related beliefs about the dangerousness of others or one's own unworthiness of care and attention. What makes trauma therapy different from general talk therapy is its specific focus on how trauma affects the brain and body. Many approaches incorporate body-based interventions that address the physiological aspects of trauma responses, recognizing that trauma is stored not just in conscious memory, but in the body's systems. These might include breathwork, mindfulness practices, or specific exercises to help regulate the nervous system. While trauma therapy can indeed be challenging work, skilled trauma therapists carefully pace the process to avoid overwhelming clients. The goal is to work within what's called the window of tolerance, challenging enough to promote change, but not so distressing that it reinforces trauma responses. With proper pacing and support, many clients find the process far less frightening than they anticipated and deeply liberating as they reclaim aspects of themselves that trauma had curtailed. Let's now explore some emerging and complementary approaches to PTSD treatment. While the therapies we've discussed have strong evidence bases, research continues to develop innovative approaches that may help address PTSD from different angles or reach populations who don't respond to traditional therapies. Ketamine-assisted psychotherapy has shown promising results for treatment-resistant PTSD. Ketamine, when administered in controlled clinical settings, appears to reduce activity in the brain's alarm center while increasing plasticity in areas involved in perspective, taking, and emotional processing. This temporary state may create an opportunity for processing traumatic material with less overwhelming emotional activation. It's important to note that this approach involves much more than just ketamine administration. It incorporates structured psychotherapy sessions before, during, and after ketamine experiences. Research on MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD has also advanced significantly, with FDA-designated breakthrough therapy status and phase 3 clinical trials showing substantial symptom reduction. Like ketamine, MDMA is administered in the context of intensive psychotherapy with specially trained providers, creating a temporary window of increased emotional accessibility while reducing fear responses that might normally block trauma processing. Moving to non-pharmacological approaches, neurofeedback trains individuals to modify their own brainwave patterns through real-time feedback. For PTSD, protocols often focus on reducing hyperarousal in areas associated with the fear response while enhancing activity in regions involved in calm, focused attention. Body-centered approaches like somatic experiencing and sensoromotor psychotherapy directly address how trauma is held in the body. These therapies help clients become aware of and gradually release trauma-related physical tension patterns, incomplete defensive responses, and dysregulated autonomic nervous system functioning that persist after trauma. Virtual reality exposure therapy offers controlled, graduated exposure to trauma-similar environments, which may be particularly helpful for combat-related PTSD where recreating contextually similar situations is otherwise difficult. The immersive nature of VR can facilitate emotional engagement with traumatic material while maintaining the safety of the therapeutic environment. Various creative arts therapies, including music therapy, art therapy, drama therapy, and dance movement therapy, provide nonverbal pathways for expressing and processing traumatic experiences. These approaches can be especially valuable for preverbal trauma or when the traumatic experience is difficult to articulate in words. It's worth emphasizing that while these emerging approaches show promise, most should be considered adjuncts to, rather than replacements for, evidence-based treatments. Many are still being researched, and access may be limited to clinical trials or specialized treatment centers. Now let's address an important question many people have. What can individuals do to help manage PTSD symptoms in their daily lives? While professional treatment is often necessary for recovery from PTSD, there are many self-help strategies that can complement formal treatment or help manage symptoms while awaiting treatment. Developing a solid understanding of PTSD as a normal response to abnormal situations is an important first step. Education about how trauma affects the brain and body can reduce self-blame and help make symptoms more predictable and manageable. Many excellent books, workbooks, and online resources are available specifically for this purpose. Establishing routines around sleep, nutrition, and physical activity provides crucial stability for nervous systems dysregulated by trauma. Regular, moderate exercise has been shown to reduce PTSD symptoms, possibly by helping discharge excess stress energy and promoting neuroplasticity. Activities that include rhythmic, bilateral movement like walking, swimming, or dancing may be particularly beneficial. Mindfulness practices tailored for trauma survivors can help build awareness of internal states without judgment or avoidance. The key adaptation for trauma is starting with brief practices focused on neutral or positive sensations rather than diving directly into awareness of difficult emotions or body sensations. Practices like resource tapping combine mindful awareness with bilateral stimulation similar to EMDR to strengthen connections to positive internal resources. Grounding techniques are essential tools for managing flashbacks, dissociation, or overwhelming emotions. These strategies help reconnect with the present moment through sensory engagement. Feeling feet on the ground, identifying objects in the immediate environment, or using strong sensory inputs like holding ice or smelling essential oils. Having a collection of personally effective grounding strategies readily available can significantly reduce the impact of triggering situations. Trigger management involves identifying personal triggers and developing plans for navigating them. Sometimes this means temporarily avoiding certain situations while building coping skills. In other cases, it means gradually approaching triggers with appropriate support and preparation. The goal isn't permanent avoidance, but rather developing increased capacity to engage with previously triggering situations without being overwhelmed. Connection with supportive others is perhaps the most powerful healing resource outside of formal therapy. Trauma often damages trust and creates isolation, but safe connections with understanding others can directly counteract these effects. This might involve peer support groups specifically for trauma survivors, strengthening existing relationships with friends and family who can provide compassionate support, or even connection with trained support animals. Creative expression through writing, art, music, or movement offers powerful channels for processing traumatic experiences and associated emotions, even without formal therapy. Expressive writing about traumatic experiences, for instance, has been shown to reduce PTSD symptoms when done in a structured, contained way. It's important to emphasize that these self-help strategies work best when approached gradually and compassionately. Pushing too hard or setting unrealistic expectations can create additional stress. The goal is to expand one's window of tolerance slowly over time, not to eliminate all distress immediately. Let's now focus on how families, friends, and partners can effectively support someone with PTSD. Supporting a loved one with PTSD can be challenging. It's difficult to witness someone suffering, responses may seem confusing or unpredictable, and supporters often worry about saying or doing the wrong thing. Understanding some key principles can make a significant difference. First and foremost, education is essential. Learning about PTSD helps supporters recognize that seemingly puzzling behaviors, like emotional numbness, angry outbursts, or avoidance, are symptoms of the condition rather than personal choices or character flaws. This understanding fosters compassion and reduces frustration or personalization of symptoms. Many treatment programs now include family education components, and numerous resources are available specifically for supporters. Listening without judgment or pressure to fix the situation is one of the most powerful gifts supporters can offer. Allow the person with PTSD to share their experiences at their own pace, without forcing disclosures or asking probing questions about traumatic details. Simple validation of their experience and emotions. That sounds really hard, or it makes sense you'd feel that way after what you experienced. Can be profoundly healing. Learning about triggers and how to navigate them collaboratively is important. This doesn't mean walking on eggshells, but rather having open conversations about what situations might be difficult and how to approach them together. Sometimes this involves advanced planning for potentially triggering events or developing signals the person can use if they need to take a break from a situation. Supporting treatment involvement while respecting autonomy strikes a crucial balance. Encouragement and practical assistance, like helping with transportation to appointments or taking on extra responsibilities during intensive treatment periods, can make a big difference, but ultimately the decision to pursue treatment must be the individual's own. Pressuring someone who isn't ready can backfire and damage trust. Taking care of your own well-being as a supporter is not selfish, it's necessary for sustainable support. Secondary traumatic stress and compassion fatigue are real risks for those in supporting roles. Maintaining your own support network, engaging in regular self-care, and potentially seeking your own counseling are important aspects of being an effective supporter over the long term. For intimate partners specifically, understanding how PTSD can affect intimacy and sexuality is important. Trauma, particularly sexual trauma, can impact physical closeness in complex ways. Open, non-pressuring communication about needs and boundaries, patience with the healing process, and sometimes couples therapy with a trauma-informed provider can help navigate these challenges. If children are involved, age-appropriate education about their loved one's PTSD helps them make sense of what they're observing without taking it personally or developing their own anxiety about the situation. Clear, simple explanations like, "Dad has strong feelings and reactions because of scary things that happened in the war, but he's working with doctors to feel better," help children understand without being burdened with traumatic details. Finally, celebrating small victories and maintaining hope is vital. Recovery from PTSD isn't usually a linear process. There are typically ups and downs, progress and temporary setbacks. Recognizing and acknowledging improvements, however small, helps sustain motivation and hope during challenging periods. Now, let's address some common misconceptions about PTSD that can create barriers to understanding and effective support. One persistent myth is that only veterans develop PTSD. While combat exposure certainly can cause PTSD, and military personnel face elevated risk due to their exposure to life-threatening situations, PTSD can develop following any traumatic experience. Sexual assault actually produces PTSD at even higher rates than combat exposure, and other causes include natural disasters, serious accidents, physical assault, childhood abuse, witnessing violence, and even certain medical events like ICU stays or complicated childbirths. Another harmful misconception is that developing PTSD is a sign of weakness or character deficiency. In reality, PTSD represents a normal response of human biology to overwhelming experiences. It can affect anyone regardless of psychological resilience or strength of character. Many people with PTSD are actually extraordinarily strong individuals who have survived incredibly difficult circumstances. Some people believe that talking about trauma will only make things worse. While timing and context matter greatly, appropriate trauma processing with adequate support is generally healing rather than harmful. The avoidance that many trauma survivors naturally develop actually tends to maintain PTSD symptoms over time. Breaking the silence around trauma in safe, supportive context is usually an important part of recovery. There's also a myth that PTSD is permanent and untreatable. As we've discussed, numerous effective treatments exist and recovery is absolutely possible. While some individuals may continue to experience certain symptoms or vulnerability to triggers even after treatment, most can experience significant symptom reduction and improved quality of life with appropriate intervention. One particularly confusing misconception involves delayed onset PTSD. Some people believe that if symptoms didn't develop immediately after trauma, they can't be related to that event. In reality, delayed onset PTSD, where full diagnostic criteria aren't met until at least 6 months after the traumatic event, is well documented. Sometimes symptoms are initially subclinical or managed through avoidance, only to emerge more fully when triggered by new stresses or life transitions. The myth that time alone heals all wounds can be especially damaging when it comes to trauma. While some trauma survivors do recover without formal intervention, many find that time alone doesn't resolve PTSD symptoms. In fact, avoidance patterns may become more entrenched over time without appropriate treatment, making recovery more challenging. Finally, there's a misconception that everyone exposed to trauma develops PTSD. In reality, while most people experience some acute stress symptoms after trauma, the majority naturally recover within a few weeks or months without developing PTSD. Understanding this natural resilience helps us focus supportive resources where they're most needed, while recognizing that seeking help for persistent symptoms reflects good self-awareness rather than abnormal vulnerability. Let's now explore some specific considerations for PTSD in special populations. While the core features of PTSD remain relatively consistent, certain groups face unique challenges that deserve specific attention. Children and adolescents may express PTSD differently than adults, with symptoms manifesting through play, drawings, or behavioral problems rather than verbal descriptions of their experiences. Developmental stage significantly impacts how trauma is processed and expressed. Additionally, trauma during critical developmental periods can affect attachment patterns, identity formation, and emotional regulation capacities in ways that extend beyond classic PTSD symptoms. Treatment approaches need to be adapted to developmental level, often incorporating play therapy, art therapy, or family-based interventions rather than purely verbal approaches. For older adults, PTSD presents distinctive challenges. Some older individuals experience trauma decades earlier, with symptoms that have waxed and waned over a lifetime. The aging process itself can sometimes trigger or exacerbate previously managed PTSD symptoms, as retirement removes the distraction of work, physical limitations increase vulnerability feelings, or cognitive changes affect coping strategies. Additionally, older adults who developed coping strategies in eras when mental health was heavily stigmatized may be particularly resistant to acknowledging psychological symptoms or seeking treatment. First responders, healthcare workers, and others in high-risk professions face repeated exposure to potentially traumatic events as an occupational hazard. This cumulative exposure can lead to a gradual building of symptoms rather than a response to a single identifiable event. The culture in many of these professions has traditionally discouraged acknowledgement of emotional impacts, creating additional barriers to seeking help. Specialized peer support programs and treatment approaches tailored to the unique aspects of occupational trauma have shown promise for these populations. Refugees and survivors of torture, war, or genocide often experience prolonged, repeated traumas compounded by displacement, loss of community, language barriers, and ongoing uncertainty about safety. Treatment approaches need to address practical survival needs alongside psychological symptoms, often incorporating cultural brokers or interpreters to bridge cultural and linguistic differences in understanding trauma and healing. For individuals with developmental or intellectual disabilities, trauma responses may be dismissed as behavioral problems or attributed to their disability rather than recognized as trauma-related. Limited verbal or cognitive abilities can complicate both assessment and treatment, requiring creative adaptations to standard approaches. Caregivers need specialized guidance to distinguish between disability-related behaviors and trauma responses and to provide appropriate support. LGBTQ individuals face elevated rates of trauma exposure and may encounter additional barriers to appropriate care, including discrimination within healthcare systems or lack of understanding about specific vulnerabilities related to minority stress. Treatment providers need awareness of these unique stressors and how they might interact with trauma responses. Across all these populations, cultural humility and responsiveness are essential. Cultural backgrounds profoundly influence how trauma is experienced, expressed, and healed. Effective treatment respects cultural understandings of distress and healing while adapting evidence-based approaches appropriately rather than imposing Western conceptualizations universally. Let's now discuss prevention strategies and building resilience against trauma. While we can't eliminate trauma exposure entirely, both individual and community-level approaches can reduce its impact. At the individual level, developing a toolkit of psychological resilience skills before trauma exposure can provide some protection. These include emotional regulation skills, problem-solving abilities, active coping strategies, and maintaining supportive social connections. Mindfulness practices have shown particular promise in building the kind of present moment awareness and acceptance that can help process difficult experiences. Physical health habits like regular exercise, adequate sleep, and nutrition support the body's natural stress recovery systems. For those who have experienced trauma but haven't developed PTSD, early interventions may prevent chronic symptoms from developing. Contrary to earlier beliefs, immediate psychological debriefing immediately after trauma does not appear protective and may actually interfere with natural recovery for some. More effective are approaches that provide practical support, foster natural coping strategies, and offer more intensive intervention only to those showing persistent symptoms several weeks after the event. At the community and societal level, prevention takes different forms. Trauma-informed systems, from schools to healthcare facilities to workplaces, incorporate understanding of trauma's prevalence and impact into their policies and practices. This approach emphasizes physical and emotional safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration, empowerment, and cultural responsiveness. Rather than asking, "What's wrong with you?" trauma-informed systems ask, "What happened to you?" This shift reduces the likelihood of institutional practices re-traumatizing vulnerable individuals. Public education about trauma and mental health reduces stigma and increases the likelihood that those experiencing symptoms will seek help early rather than suffering in silence. Policy initiatives addressing community violence, child abuse, and other common trauma sources can reduce exposure rates in the first place. For specific high-risk populations like military personnel, targeted resilience training programs have shown promise in reducing PTSD rates following deployment. These programs typically combine psychoeducation about stress responses with specific skills training in areas like cognitive flexibility, meaning making, and social support maintenance. It's important to note that resilience is not simply an individual characteristic, but is fostered or hindered by systemic factors including economic stability, access to resources, and societal treatment of marginalized groups. Addressing social determinants of health and structural inequities represents a crucial but often overlooked aspect of trauma prevention. Let's now discuss the frontier of PTSD research and what new developments may be on the horizon. The field of trauma studies continues to evolve rapidly, with several exciting directions showing promise for enhanced understanding and treatment. Neuroimaging research is providing increasingly detailed pictures of how trauma affects brain structure and function, helping move beyond self-reported symptoms to objective biomarkers of PTSD. This research has identified specific neural circuits involved in trauma responses and is beginning to predict which individuals might respond best to different treatment approaches based on their brain activity patterns. As this work advances, we may see more personalized treatment recommendations based on individual neurobiology rather than one-size-fits-all approaches. Genetics and epigenetics research is exploring how trauma's effects can extend across generations. Studies have found that children of Holocaust survivors, for example, show different stress hormone profiles and gene expression patterns than children of non-traumatized parents. This suggests that trauma's impact may be transmitted not just through psychological mechanisms like parenting behavior, but through actual biological pathways, potentially through epigenetic modifications that affect how genes are expressed without changing the genetic code itself. Understanding these mechanisms opens new possibilities for interrupting intergenerational trauma transmission. The gut-brain connection represents another frontier, with emerging evidence that the microbiome, the collection of bacteria in our digestive system, influences and is influenced by stress and trauma. Some research suggests that specific probiotic strains or dietary approaches might help modulate the body's stress response systems, potentially offering new adjunctive approaches to traditional PTSD treatments. Technology is revolutionizing both assessment and treatment delivery. Smartphone apps can now provide the-moment symptom tracking and deliver skills training or grounding techniques exactly when needed. Virtual reality enables more immersive and controlled exposure therapy experiences. Telehealth approaches extend access to specialized trauma treatment for those in remote areas or with mobility limitations. As these technologies advance, we'll likely see increasingly sophisticated digital tools that can adapt to individual needs and responses in real time. Cultural adaptation of evidence-based treatments continues to evolve, moving beyond simple translation to deeper engagement with diverse healing traditions and culturally specific understandings of distress and recovery. This work acknowledges that while the neurobiology of trauma may be universal, the meaning made of traumatic experiences and pathways to healing are profoundly influenced by cultural context. Community-based and collective approaches to trauma recovery are gaining increased attention, recognizing that when entire communities experience trauma, as in the case of natural disasters, community violence, or historical trauma affecting marginalized groups, recovery must address collective as well as individual healing processes. These approaches integrate trauma-focused interventions with community empowerment, cultural renewal, and collective meaning, making to address the social and systemic aspects of trauma that individual therapy alone cannot reach. The concept of post-traumatic growth, positive psychological changes that can emerge from the struggle with highly challenging life circumstances, has generated significant research interest. While not everyone experiences such growth, and it should never be presented as an expectation that minimizes suffering, understanding the conditions that facilitate growth after trauma may offer additional pathways for transforming traumatic experiences beyond symptom reduction alone. Now, let's discuss navigating the healthcare system for PTSD treatment, as finding appropriate care can sometimes feel overwhelming. If you're seeking treatment for yourself or helping someone else find care, here are some practical considerations. The first step is often finding a provider with specific expertise in trauma treatment, not just general mental health care. Not all mental health professionals have specialized training in evidence-based trauma therapies, so it's appropriate to ask about a potential provider's training and experience with PTSD specifically. Professional directories often allow searching by specialty, and many trauma-focused organizations maintain referral lists of qualified providers. When insurance coverage or financial constraints are concerned, several options exist. Community mental health centers often offer sliding scale fees and may have clinicians trained in trauma treatment. Some specialized PTSD treatment programs, particularly those associated with research institutions or VA hospitals, may offer free or reduced cost treatment, especially if you qualify for ongoing research studies. Additionally, telehealth options have expanded considerably, sometimes offering more affordable rates than traditional in-person therapy. For those with insurance, understanding what your plan covers before beginning treatment can prevent unexpected costs. Many plans limit the number of sessions or types of providers covered, and some evidence-based trauma treatments require a commitment of 12-16 sessions for optimal results. If coverage is denied, knowing how to appeal these decisions can be crucial. Patient advocacy organizations often provide guidance on navigating these processes effectively. Different treatment settings offer different advantages. Outpatient therapy, typically weekly sessions with a therapist, is the most common approach and works well for many people with PTSD. Intensive outpatient programs, IOPs, provide more support, usually multiple sessions per week, while still allowing you to live at home and maintain daily responsibilities. Residential or inpatient programs provide the highest level of support and are typically recommended when symptoms are severe enough to prevent functioning in daily life or when safety concerns exist. For those with limited access to specialized care due to geographic location or other barriers, creative solutions may be necessary. Telehealth has dramatically expanded access to specialized PTSD treatment, enabling work with providers who might be physically distant. Self-help resources guided by books or online programs can supplement limited professional care, though they work best when combined with at least some professional guidance. If you're helping someone else navigate this process, recognize that seeking help for trauma can itself feel vulnerable and frightening. Offering practical assistance, like researching options, helping with phone calls, or accompanying them to initial appointments if welcomed, can make a significant difference in overcoming inertia or avoidance. At the same time, respecting their autonomy in treatment decisions is crucial for maintaining a sense of agency that trauma may have compromised. Let's explore the unique considerations for healing from trauma related to interpersonal violence, as these types of trauma present distinct challenges. Traumas caused intentionally by other humans, such as physical or sexual assault, abuse, or combat, tend to have more severe and complex psychological impacts than impersonal traumas like natural disasters or accidents. This difference likely stems from how interpersonal violence violates basic assumptions about human relationships and often occurs in contexts where trust has been established. For survivors of interpersonal violence, rebuilding the capacity for trust represents a central challenge in recovery. The betrayal inherent in harm caused by another person, particularly someone who should have provided care or protection, can fundamentally alter one's view of human relationships. Treatment approaches need to explicitly address these trust violations while carefully balancing validation of legitimate self-protection instincts with gradual expansion of relational capacity. Safety planning takes on heightened importance when the source of trauma may still pose a threat. For those leaving abusive relationships or situations, practical safety measures must be integrated with psychological treatment. This might include coordination with legal services, domestic violence advocates, or temporary housing resources. Psychological healing is extraordinarily difficult if physical safety remains in question. The issue of justice and its relationship to healing requires thoughtful navigation. While legal proceedings can provide important validation and protection, they can also be sources of re-traumatization when systems fail to function as they should. Different individuals have different needs regarding pursuit of formal justice, and there's no single right approach. Trauma-informed legal advocacy can help survivors make informed choices about engagement with legal systems while developing alternative conceptions of justice when formal systems fail. Shame often features prominently in recovery from interpersonal violence. Unlike fear, which is directed toward external threats, shame involves painful self-judgment and the sense of being fundamentally flawed or tainted by what happened. Perpetrators of abuse often deliberately induce shame as a means of control and cultural victim blaming can reinforce these messages. Effective treatment directly addresses shame through compassionate exploration of internalized negative beliefs and restoration of dignity and self-worth. For survivors of childhood abuse or neglect, developmental trauma often creates challenges beyond standard PTSD symptoms. When trauma occurs during critical periods of brain and personality development, it can affect fundamental aspects of identity, attachment patterns, and self-regulation capacities. Treatment approaches for developmental trauma often need to address these foundational issues alongside more classical PTSD symptoms, sometimes requiring longer-term work than approaches designed for adult-onset trauma. Community and collective healing take on special importance for survivors of interpersonal violence, who often experience profound isolation. Survivor advocacy groups, appropriately facilitated support groups, and wider social movements challenging violence can all provide crucial context for transforming individual suffering into collective strength and change. Many survivors find that engagement with prevention efforts or support for other survivors becomes an important part of their own healing journey. Let's now discuss the importance of cultural considerations in understanding and treating PTSD. Culture profoundly shapes every aspect of trauma response, from which events are perceived as traumatic to how distress is expressed, to what healing pathways are trusted. Different cultures have varying thresholds for what experiences are considered traumatic or worthy of formal attention. In some cultures, certain hardships might be normalized as expected parts of life rather than exceptional traumas requiring intervention. For instance, communities with histories of collective hardship may normalize suffering in ways that discourage acknowledgement of individual trauma impacts. The expression of distress varies dramatically across cultural contexts. In many non-Western cultures, psychological distress is primarily expressed through somatic physical complaints rather than emotional language. A person might report persistent headaches, digestive problems, or generalized pain rather than directly describing emotional symptoms like anxiety or intrusive memories. Without cultural awareness, these presentations can be misdiagnosed as purely medical conditions rather than recognized as trauma responses. Cultural values around emotional expression and help-seeking also influence trauma responses. In cultures emphasizing stoicism and self-reliance, emotional distress may be tightly contained or expressed only in highly restricted contexts. Cultures with strong emphasis on family privacy may discourage seeking help outside family systems, even when internal resources are insufficient for trauma healing. Explanatory models, how people understand why they're suffering, vary widely across cultures. Some may interpret trauma symptoms through spiritual or religious frameworks, e.g., as spirit possession, ancestral disturbance, or divine punishment, while others may understand them through social, political, or biological lenses. Effective treatment engages respectfully with these interpretations rather than imposing Western biomedical explanations. Healing pathways similarly reflect cultural diversity. Traditional healing practices, whether religious rituals, traditional medicine, community ceremonies, or artistic traditions, often contain wisdom accumulated over generations about processing collective and individual suffering. Rather than dismissing these approaches as unscientific, trauma-informed care increasingly recognizes their value and explores integrative approaches that bring together evidence-based treatments with culturally resonant healing traditions. Historical and intergenerational trauma add another layer of complexity. Many cultural and ethnic groups have experienced collective traumas like colonization, slavery, genocide, or forced migration. The impacts of these historical traumas can echo through generations via multiple pathways: biological through epigenetic changes, psychological through parenting patterns, social self through disrupted community structures, and economic through persisting disadvantage. Addressing these layered traumas requires approaches that recognize both individual and collective dimensions of healing. For clinicians working cross-culturally, cultural humility, an ongoing process of self-reflection and openness to learning about cultural differences, is essential. This involves moving beyond superficial notions of cultural competence to recognize the limitations of one's cultural perspective and engage respectfully with diverse understandings of suffering and healing. It also means recognizing how power differentials between dominant and marginalized cultures affect the therapeutic relationship and trauma recovery process. Now, let's discuss supporting recovery in the face of ongoing trauma or chronic stress, as many people must navigate healing while still facing challenging circumstances. Ideally, trauma recovery occurs in conditions of relative safety and stability, but reality often falls short of this ideal. Many individuals face ongoing traumatic stressors, whether continued domestic violence, community violence, war, displacement, discrimination, or severe economic hardship, while simultaneously trying to heal from past trauma. In these contexts, traditional phased trauma treatment models require adaptation. Rather than expecting a linear progression from safety establishment to trauma processing to integration, treatment becomes more cyclical, with frequent returns to safety and stabilization work as new challenges arise. The emphasis shifts toward building resilience and coping capacity in the midst of adversity rather than expecting complete symptom resolution. Dialectical behavioral therapy (DBT) skills, originally developed for chronic self-harm and suicidality, prove particularly valuable in contexts of ongoing stress. These skills focus on distress tolerance, coping with painful emotions without making situations worse, emotional regulation as influencing which emotions arise and how they're expressed, mindfulness-aware, non-judgmental attention to present experience, and interpersonal effectiveness, maintaining relationships while respecting personal boundaries. These practical skills help manage trauma symptoms while navigating ongoing challenges. For those in chronically stressful environments, identifying islands of safety, specific times, places, relationships, or activities where relative safety can be experienced becomes crucial. Even brief, consistent experiences of safety can help regulate the nervous system and provide respite from constant hypervigilance. Simple rituals marking transitions between higher stress and lower stress contexts help the body recognize when heightened alertness is and isn't needed. Targeted cognitive approaches addressing helplessness and hopelessness take on particular importance when stressors cannot be immediately eliminated. Identifying spheres of influence and control, however small, helps counter the profound disempowerment that trauma and ongoing adversity can create. Meaning-making processes that connect individual suffering to larger purposes, whether through spiritual frameworks, community action, or creative expression, can sustain resilience when immediate circumstances remain difficult. For helpers and clinicians, secondary traumatic stress and vicarious traumatization present real risks when working with trauma survivors, especially in contexts of ongoing trauma. Self-care shifts from being a luxury to an ethical imperative in these situations, as impaired helpers cannot provide effective support. Organizations serving trauma survivors in high-stress contexts increasingly recognize the need for systemic approaches to staff well-being, including reasonable workloads, regular supervision, and organizational cultures that acknowledge the emotional impacts of trauma work. Throughout all of this, maintaining realistic expectations becomes essential. Recovery in contexts of ongoing stress may look different than recovery under ideal conditions. Small improvements, increased coping capacity, and moments of connection and meaning amid difficulty represent significant successes deserving recognition and celebration. Let's now explore the powerful connection between trauma, social justice, and advocacy. Increasingly, trauma is understood not just as an individual psychological phenomenon, but is intimately connected to social and political realities. Many trauma survivors find that engagement with larger social change efforts becomes an important part of their healing journey, transforming individual suffering into collective action. The concept of structural trauma recognizes how social systems, not just individual perpetrators, can be sources of harm. Racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, and other forms of systematic oppression create conditions for ongoing traumatization through both acute incidents of violence and chronic stress from discrimination and marginalization. When entire communities experience collective traumas through systematic violence or oppression, individual therapy alone may be insufficient without acknowledgement of these larger contextual factors. Trauma-informed social justice approaches recognize these connections and work to address both individual healing needs and the systemic conditions that enable trauma. This might involve advocating for policy changes to prevent trauma, like expanded intimate partner violence protections or police accountability measures, creating trauma-informed institutional practices, or building community-based healing resources in underserved areas. For many trauma survivors, channeling personal experience into advocacy provides powerful opportunities for meaning-making and post-traumatic growth. Whether through formal organizations Grassroots community efforts, artistic expression, or educational initiatives, sharing one's story in service of preventing others from experiencing similar harm can transform victim identity into survivor advocate identity. This shift from passive suffering to active engagement with creating change can be profoundly healing. However, the relationship between personal healing and advocacy work requires thoughtful navigation. Engaging in advocacy before establishing sufficient personal stability and coping resources can sometimes lead to re-traumatization or impede individual recovery. Finding the right timing and boundaries for advocacy involvement represents an important aspect of trauma recovery for those drawn to this path. For those working in advocacy roles, especially those with personal trauma histories, sustainable self-care practices become essential. This includes clear boundaries between work and personal life, regular engagement with restorative activities, and organizational cultures that recognize and address the emotional impacts of trauma-focused advocacy. The principle of nothing about us without us has particular relevance in trauma-focused advocacy. Policies and programs intended to address trauma have the greatest legitimacy and effectiveness when developed with meaningful input from trauma survivors themselves. However, this principle must be implemented in ways that create genuine partnership rather than tokenistic inclusion or exploitation of survivor stories without corresponding influence on decision-making. The growing field of trauma journalism provides an example of how these principles can be applied in practice. This approach recognizes both the potential for news reporting to re-traumatize survivors and communities, and the opportunity for journalism to contribute to healing and prevention through trauma-informed reporting practices. These include giving survivors control over how their stories are told, avoiding unnecessary graphic details, providing context rather than sensationalizing isolated incidents, and including information about resources and resilience alongside accounts of trauma. As we begin to wrap up our discussion, let's reflect on the journey of trauma recovery and what healing really means. One of the most important realizations in trauma work is that recovery doesn't necessarily mean returning to exactly who you were before the trauma or eliminating all trauma-related symptoms. Rather, it involves integrating the traumatic experience into your life narrative in a way that allows it to become part of your story without defining or dominating your identity and daily experience. For many, recovery involves a shift from feeling defined by trauma to recognizing it as one significant life experience among many. The traumatic event moves from being an ever-present, overwhelming reality to a chapter in a much larger life story, still significant but no longer all-consuming. This integration process often involves finding language to articulate what happened and its impact, contextualizing the experience within one's broader life trajectory, and gradually constructing meaning that allows for continued growth despite, or sometimes even partially because of, what happened. Reclaiming choice and agency represents another crucial aspect of healing. Trauma often involves profound helplessness and loss of control, and recovery necessarily involves rebuilding a sense of efficacy and self-determination. This doesn't mean controlling everything in life, an impossible standard, but rather developing confidence in one's ability to influence important aspects of experience and respond effectively to challenges as they arise. Connection with others typically plays a central role in deep healing. While trauma often damages trust and creates isolation, rebuilding meaningful relationships, whether with trusted friends and family, therapeutic relationships, support groups, spiritual communities, or other forms of connection, directly counteracts these effects. Through safe relationships, survivors can experience being seen, valued, and supported not despite their trauma history, but as whole people whose experiences, including trauma, have contributed to who they are. Post-traumatic growth, the experience of positive psychological change resulting from the struggle with highly challenging life circumstances, represents a possible, though not inevitable, outcome of trauma recovery work. Common dimensions of such growth include greater appreciation for life, more meaningful relationships, increased sense of personal strength, recognition of new possibilities, and spiritual or existential development. Importantly, this growth doesn't eliminate suffering or suggest trauma was somehow beneficial. but rather reflects the human capacity to derive meaning and positive transformation even from painful experiences. Throughout the recovery journey, self-compassion serves as both a process and an outcome of healing. Trauma often generates harsh self-judgment, shame, or self-blame, and counteracting these patterns with kind, understanding attention to one's own suffering represents a profound shift. Learning to treat oneself with the same care and compassion one would offer a good friend facing similar circumstances enables both recovery from past trauma and resilience in the face of future challenges. For those supporting trauma survivors, whether as mental health professionals, medical providers, friends, family members, or colleagues, perhaps the most important insight is that healing happens in relationship. While each person's recovery journey is unique and ultimately their own to navigate, none of us heal in isolation. Creating environments of safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment lays the groundwork for healing connections that make recovery possible. As we come to the close of our discussion, I want to emphasize that if you or someone you know is struggling with trauma-related symptoms, reaching out for support is a sign of strength, not weakness. The journey of trauma recovery can be challenging, but it also holds possibilities for profound healing and growth that may seem unimaginable when symptoms are at their most intense. Remember that recovery isn't a straight line. It typically involves progress and setbacks, good days and difficult ones. This natural variation doesn't indicate failure, but is simply part of the process. Each step toward greater understanding, self-compassion, and engagement with life represents real progress, even when the overall journey takes time. No matter where you or your loved ones might be in relationship to trauma, whether facing acute symptoms well along in recovery, supporting someone else's healing journey, or simply seeking to better understand this important aspect of human experience, I hope our conversation today has provided valuable insights and practical guidance. If you found this information helpful, please consider subscribing to our channel for more discussions on mental health topics. Your comments and questions help shape future episodes, so please share your thoughts below. And if you know someone who might benefit from this information, sharing this video could make a real difference in their healing journey. Thank you for joining me today in exploring this important topic. Remember that while trauma may be a common human experience, so too are resilience, connection, and the capacity for healing. I'm Dr. Olivia Bennett, and I look forward to continuing our mental health conversations in future episodes.